Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're reading outside of book club, the ones we get to pick and choose.
Today on my list, that includes Things I Know About Love by former Sunday Times dating columnist Dolly Alderton, Billie by French author Anna Gavalda, A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. I know you want to listen to that one. And Moneyball by Michael Lewis.
And on my list there's Mrs. Gaskell and Me by Nell Stevens and I Am by Maggie O'Farrell.
So I don't know how I got quite so lucky, but I've had a ton of time to do my own reading between book clubs. And I mean, we have a podcast about our book club books, so obviously, we're quite keen on the idea of reading book clubs. However, I would argue there's no greater pleasure than finishing your book club book with plenty of time to spare and thinking, oh my God, what can I read? I don't have to do my assigned reading. I could read anything.
Yeah, I do think of it now as there's my required reading and there's my non-required reading.
I went to the Waterstones on Gower Street.
It's a big one.
For the first time.
I used to work there.
For the first time. How lucky you were to work there.
Yeah.
It's like a Harry Potter bookstore.
It felt like that way at the time. It used to be Dylan's when I worked there, but I worked in the fiction department. The front line, as I used to think of it, the ground floor.
What a dream.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I went in and I had finished my book club books and I bought books that I wanted to read. One of which is Anna Gavalda's Billie and the other is A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent. However, it's actually by Marie Brennan. Which would you like to hear about first?
Well, let's start with the Gavalda and then move on to dragons.
Okay.
So I don't know Anna Gavalda. She's a French writer, isn't she?
She is. And I recommended her at the end of our Lullaby episode. And I realized at the time that she had written some more novels since I had last checked in on her. She's not that popular in the UK. I think her novel Hunting and Gathering did very well in the English language.
That sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, it's great. It's familiar because that's the one I recommended at the end of the podcast.
All right.
That's why you know it. Billie was new. It had been published since I had kind of read the last books by her. So I think everything she's written has been translated, but you can see this one is from Europa Editions.
It looks quite French.
It looks very French, whereas her other books were picked up by mainstream British publishers. I think the last one might have been Penguin or Random House. I love her. I think she could be like Marmite, though. She writes in a really chatty, conversational voice. I do not know what her reputation is in France. I know she's a bestseller, but I don't know if she's like the Jojo Moyes of France or if she has literary stature. I mean, I don't think she's won any awards, so she might well be kind of popular fiction. Hey, who doesn't love popular fiction, especially when it's French? This one starts off with the main character, whose name is Billie, at the bottom of a ravine, having plunged down its side with her best friend Frank, and they are at the bottom of a rockside in the Cevennes National Park. And as she says, where there was no cell phone signal, where there wasn't a sheep's rear end, let alone that of a shepherd, and where no one would ever find us. I had really bashed up my arm, but I could still move it, while he, it was clear, was in 1,000 pieces.
That sounds good. I would want to read on.
And then it is her telling the story of their friendship and how they kind of saved each other in their teen years. She was very much on the fringes of French society. She smells, her family is incredibly dysfunctional, the authorities don't bother with them. And then there's Frank, who's from a fairly well-off middle-class background, but is obviously gay, whether or not anyone can kind of identify that in this small town or not. But still, both of them are kind of these outsiders who then come together, save each other, pull themselves up and head to Paris. And Billie is telling the story of their friendship to a star. I mean, that's what's hilarious about this book, is she's kind of pleading to what I suppose would be God, but in this case, she's talking to a star up above them, saying, please don't let us die here. And it goes on from there. It was great. I read it in about 3 hours. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, sounds good. Do you want to pause before you talk about the dragons? I could tell you the reason I haven't read that much recently is not because I haven't been reading, but because I've been reading, I think it'd be fair to say I've been quite bogged down with The Last Samurai by Helen De Witt, which was actually my book club Christmas book. And we're not going to do a podcast on it, because I think we're just very nicely backed up with other books that we're going to talk about on the podcast. But we did read this book, and it's 500 pages. It's quite an alienating read, but not in a kind of good way, I'm afraid I'm finding. It's a struggle to get your head around the characters. It's a mother and her incredibly bright woman, as in like off the chart clever, and her son who is similarly gifted. And they're speaking multiple languages, and they're exploring, he's 4 and he's reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then he starts learning Japanese, and it's at the beginning from the perspective of the mother, and that kind of worked quite well and you're quite engaged with that. But then it switches to the perspective of the son, and there's a thing about the Seven Samurai film which the mother is obsessed with, and meanwhile the son is on a hunt to find out who his father is. He doesn't know. She's a sort of single mother, and he doesn't know who his father is, and she's sort of given him a few clues, so he's tracking down these different men to try and almost like audition them to find out if they might be his father. I don't know, I still haven't finished it. It's just a very, very long read, and you can't skip anything, and sometimes I've actually had to turn back a page just to check, which I found quite annoying.
Just check you've understood it.
Yeah, just what did that mean? And it almost felt like, I was trying to sum it up, it felt a bit like, have you ever read any David Foster Wallace?
I wondered if that was the name going to come off your lips.
Infinite Jest, which actually is a completely amazing book. I haven't finished it, but what I read of it, I just really respected. And that comes together, and that has a kind of coherence to it that unfortunately this does not have. And maybe she's going to draw it all together in some amazing way at the end. Let's see. But I'm dubious at this point. I'm
sort of willfully curious now that you have let me off from reading it.
Yeah, I couldn't. With 500 pages, you're not going to thank me for putting you through it.
It was on a list
yes.
of the top books of the 21st century.
Yes, so
which was a really rubbish list.
Well, so the New York, I thought it was an interesting list, but I think it was the New York Times that got this sort of subdivision which is called the Vulture, maybe sort of Culture Vulture, and they got a sort of
I think it was only 25 people.
That's
though.
right.
That's why it was weird.
Writers and sort of various cultural literary figures to try and attempt to put together a survey of the best literary fiction of the 21st century thus far. And this book was the book that made the top of that list, which I do think actually, I thought that was a really interesting list. I sort of scanned through it and thought, oh yeah, I'd like to read that, and never heard of that. And I have that on my shelf and I've never read it. I should maybe bother to pick it up.
But as I understood it, it only had 3 votes because they didn't, and maybe this is a good thing, but usually for awards, there's someone, I don't know who, decides on the long list, and then the judges read the long list, and then they shortlist, and then they decide. Whereas in this list, they just ask people to come up with on the spot, or I guess after consideration, but as an individual, their favorite books. And so Helen De Witt, The Last Samurai, had 3 votes, which kind of set it higher than others, even though that's only 3 out of 25. Yeah,
because that's the only way we were a bit misled, because we were sort of reading this like, well, what's so great about this book? It made the top of this list. But actually, now it sounds like on a fairly flimsy basis it made the top of the list. Anyway, I'll finish it, and then maybe I'll let you all know how it turns out.
Did you have a palate cleanser?
What something I've been reading? Well, so occasionally I've been putting this down and dipping into other things. Is that what you meant?
Yes, that's exactly what I meant.
Yes, I read a wonderful book called Mrs. Gaskell and Me by Nell Stevens. You may remember me rhapsodizing about Bleaker House by Nell Stevens.
I do, and I've always wanted to read it.
Yeah, so she goes off and lives on this uninhabited island in the Falklands because she needs to be somewhere where there's sort of solitude in order to be able to write. And this is at the beginning of her career as a writer, where she's still a student. She travels there on a bursary and she's really finding her voice. And this is about that experience of going to this place and trying to work out if she can be a writer or not, if she has what it takes. And something I read afterwards on Instagram, I think it was, suddenly made me think, oh, did she really go to the island? Maybe she never did. My usual kind of credulous way, I just never really questioned that, whether or not she went or not. But perhaps she didn't. Anyway, if she didn't go, I just think it's even more brilliant because it was so inventive. I really liked it, and I loved her voice, and she's just very funny and immediate, and I really enjoyed reading her. So I was quite keen to read Mrs. Gaskell and Me. Rare for me that I kind of seek something out by the same author, actually. Often if I read something I love, I sort of tend to just leave it at that, because sometimes I find, you read something else by the same author and it wasn't quite as good, and then that somehow takes away from the thing I read that I love. So I'm almost a bit wary of reading other things, which is probably very silly and limiting of me. But anyway, in this instance, I did seek out this book.
Beautiful cover.
Yeah, it has the same beautiful cover. She's just got this wonderful jacket designer who, both Bleaker House I picked up because of the cover, and this is obviously the same person who's done it. And
have you read a lot of Elizabeth Gaskell?
No, I've only ever read Wives and Daughters, which I read a very, very long time ago, and I don't remember much about it, but I do remember that I loved reading it. This is also very much sort of this autobiographical memoir of her time studying for her PhD. And she is writing about a circle of writers and artists who kind of congregated in Rome in a particular period of time. And Mrs. Gaskell was one of those people who went there. But Mrs. Gaskell is really her main kind of passion and source of interest. And so she, on the one hand, is telling the story of this PhD study. On the other, she's telling the story of Mrs. Gaskell and kind of bringing to life her biography in a sort of fictional way, which is just lovely. It's like she just brings her to life, and it's like you can kind of share her experiences and imagine what she might have been feeling about things, and it's really well done. And then there's a third strand, which is this failed relationship that Nell Stevens has with a man called Max, who she's deeply and passionately in love with, and things don't work out, and then it's about, you know, how you come to terms with that and whether or not you're able to move on, and it's just all woven together really well, and I loved it, and it made me laugh. Some of the scenes, you know, with the PhD students are just hilarious. They're really good. And I sort of love the thing about Gaskell. I think it made me want to read more Elizabeth Gaskell.
I've just watched belatedly the BBC series of North and South, which I think came out about 15-20 years ago, and it started and I was like, oh my god, this is the best thing ever. You know, when you have like it would have been like watching The Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth and the woman whose name I never remember, Jennifer Ealing, for the first time, just like stumbling upon it. I haven't read that much Mrs. Gaskell either. I was going to say it's weird that we call her Mrs. Gaskell, but that was the convention in the 19th century. It's just kind of stuck around.
No, and there's a thing about that. Why is she Mrs. Gaskell and never Elizabeth? But yes, she is.
Well, I would love to read that. That looks really good.
Yeah.
I think the time has come for the dragons.
Yes.
Everyone is dying to hear about A Natural History of Dragons,
well,
a memoir by Lady Trent.
Tell me about them.
You might read it. I mean, as far as dragon covers go,
it looks all right. I've still got about 250 pages of Helen De Witt to get through.
We've got a dragon on the front, but it's a natural history style. A natural history style. Where to start? Lady Trent is a fictional character, and she is now maybe in her 70s or 80s, and she's writing about her youth and her love of dragons in a fantastical nation that bears much, much, much resemblance to 19th century England, and her challenges in embracing her love of dragons. And it begins with her talking about how she fell in love with dragons, because they are a real thing in the way that bears in our world are a real thing. And because she was an aristocratic young woman, about her struggles to kind of learn about dragons and get access to her father's library, and then her marriage, and then her journey up into what would probably be maybe Belarus in our world to study dragons. And then it turns into a bit of a mystery, what's happening to the dragons. It actually lost me a bit at that point, and I love dragons. But it was a very light, easy read. I don't think anyone else is ever going to read it unless they have a taste for dragons and fantasy. But I'd been dying to read it because I had seen it on Instagram a fair amount.
Yeah, it's got quite a good cover.
A reasonable cover for a fantasy novel.
Yeah, it's quite crossover-y. Like, it's not too fantasy.
Yeah, you know what? I think they were trying to make that leap. Probably wisely, because although this is a fantasy novel, there's no magic. It's very much like our world in 19th century, except that dragons happen to exist, and our lady narrator wants to go and study them, like any naturalist would at the time.
So what? Just sort of a great bit of light reading.
Yeah, you know when
it's
you
not
finish,
going to change your life.
No, you know when you finish a book and you're like, well, yeah, I did that. That's how I felt about that one.
I read something that sort of slightly knocked my socks off. I didn't even mean to read it. It's been beside my bed for a long time. It's Maggie O'Farrell's I Am. I picked it up in the Keats Library secondhand book sale, which is just the most fabulous secondhand book sale I think I've ever been to. And it was just there waiting for me. And the other day I was waiting for the baby to go to sleep, so I kind of have to stick around just to make sure she settles. And I picked it off my shelf and started reading it. And I was there for like the next hour and a half because I couldn't put it down. It's a memoir. It's a story. It's structured around her life, but specifically brushes with death that she's had, and not necessarily her own death, but sometimes it's people very close to her. And it's just extraordinary. It's so well written. It's so vivid and immediate. It's one of those things I was thinking there's a kind of thing, it's almost something you only know if you experience it the hard way. And, some people have, and a lot of people happily haven't. But, if you go through something very traumatic and you lose someone very close to you, you become aware of the fragility of life. And, it's sort of a veil, isn't it, that separates us from death. And when you've experienced something like that, you become aware of how thin that veil is and how precarious things are. And then, happily, with time, what happens is our normal, what's the word? We have a sort of natural optimism, I suppose, and hopefulness that cushions us against that. If people went around in that state all the time, it would be terrible. No one would do anything. We'd all be too worried and depressed. As it is, gradually things come back to normal, and normal for us is not to be perhaps so aware and so preoccupied with those things. And somehow she manages to explore that in a way that feels sort of safe. And so you get to experience these things through her eyes. And boy, oh boy, she has been through some stuff. You can't quite believe the things that she's experienced, and she's just managed to get through them and keep going and write this beautiful book. And she's a well-known writer. I think she's written lots of other things, which I'd now be very interested to read. It felt like such an extraordinary thing because it almost felt like what she's offering you is the gift of knowledge. If you read this and you read along with her, you are going to learn something. And what you're going to learn is really important. And it's something that you might not find out another way. And what you're left with is everything that's meaningful about life and everything that's precious, and why every day when you go out and the sun shines, you should take a moment to really consider that. I don't know if this is selling it or not.
Well, I can't quite decide because it sounds quite fraught. It sounds like it could be quite emotional.
It sort of is and it isn't,
and upsetting.
Though, because there's a sort of certain detachment. That's what I mean about it's safe. In a way, almost, it's interesting, we were talking recently about Lullaby by Leila Slimani. We did the show on it, and that book wasn't really safe. That was kind of quite a scary book to read in lots of ways. This nanny who sort of murders the children that she's looking after. And this never felt like that to me. But nonetheless, it's grappling with some big ideas and just so interesting and relevant and important. It's about being a mother, and it's about being a human being, and it's about being alive. And it's also beautiful. It's just sort of beautifully written in that way that you're not even aware of the writing when you're reading it. You're just hearing this voice and experiencing it. It's just incredible. Really incredible book.
Would it be a great book club book?
I think so, yes. I think it would be. Yeah. I just can't imagine it not being. I haven't actually even finished it because I'm also not reading it sequentially, because I sort of dipped in. I idly picked it up, just idly read a chapter. And then, as I say, I think I read to the end from that point. And now I need to go back and.
And if it's 17 brushes with death, you can kind of dip in to each of these 17 stories. I imagine they're self-contained.
Yeah, and it's slightly surreal, although I suspect probably it's most satisfying just to read it sequentially. But, something bizarre. Like at one point she was incredibly ill as a child. She had encephalitis. She nearly died, and she was confined to a wheelchair. She was in hospital for a very long period of time, and then the sort of years of rehabilitation it took her to get back to the point where she could walk normally and function normally. And she was 8 years old when this happened to her. But within all of this, there was a bizarre moment where she was visited by Jimmy Savile.
Oh, God.
I know. And at the time, she didn't know. She was 8 years old. But interestingly, the nurse who was in the room with her refused to leave her alone with him. He said, "Oh, it's okay, you can leave now." And the nurse was like, "No, I have to be here." But yeah, so it's just so unexpected and kind of odd. But it's that thing about it's odd, but it's life. Life is odd, and
that sounds really good,
amazing.
In a very different way, I think this book is quite life enhancing. It is Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. Have you ever heard of Dolly Alderton?
I've seen that around. The cover, it's a sort of beautiful typographic cover, and then it's got some of the words scrubbed out. Everything I know about parties, dates, friends, jobs, life, all scrubbed out, and then you're left with love. And it's the sort of thing that, I've picked it up a few times.
I borrowed this off my colleague, and it had already been read by 4 women in my office.
It's funny because it does look like an old second-hand copy, but it's just because it's been well handled.
Well handled. And 4 of the women in my studio have now read it out of 5. And I think I'm going to take it back now and let the 5th woman read it. It's really compulsive. And I thought that it would just be a bit light and silly. Dolly Alderton is probably about my age, early 30s, mid 30s. And she was the dating columnist for the Sunday Times. And she, by her own description, is sort of this statuesque 6'1" blonde. I mean, she never says like, "Oh God, I'm incredibly beautiful," but you get the sense
She is, though.
She that picture.
I've seen that
she's
picture
very
now.
beautiful.
Yeah.
And this is the story of her life, basically. And there's so much recognition in it, starting with MSN romances. You see, you're looking at me with blank eyes,
Yep.
and I am
MSN,
curious.
like Microsoft Network? What does that mean?
MSN chat.
Right.
Okay, so we've had this discussion in the office. Will this book appeal to people who are either, say, over 35 or under 28? Because there was this window in technology where you communicated with all your friends on MSN Messenger.
Right.
And I have never read, unsurprisingly, anyone talk about the role of MSN Messenger in your romantic life when you were like a 13, 14, 15 preteen and you would go home and talk to all the friends you'd just seen at school, or even better, maybe to add people who you would never talk to at school. And so it starts off talking about that. It talks about how she met her best friend, and their friendship, in a way, is like the heart of this novel. When it says everything I know about love, that thread of love is very much her friendship with Farley.
Who's Farley?
Her best friend.
Right.
And they grew up in the suburbs of North London. It's very tongue-in-cheek. One of my friends was saying, "Oh, I don't know if it's for me." And I was like, no. Dolly will win you over 100%. She was an absolute wild thing for quite some time. And this is also the story of her growing up and kind of growing out of the booze and the drugs and the sex and starting to think about why she was doing these things and maybe how it was making her feel, because she had just fallen into a real bleak phase of depression by the time she was 25. It's about the therapy that helps her transcend that depression. It's about her battles with anorexia and obviously the ups and downs of dating. My favorite bit, and I could just read them aloud to people, because she's a blogger, I suspect that there's articles or sort of episodic things dropped throughout that appeared on her blog first. And she does these incredibly funny send-ups of the letters you get inviting you to hen parties, baby showers, weddings, all of these sort of over-the-top, fake, humble brags. And also just like incredible presumption about what you should do and how much money you should spend on someone's hen party or baby shower. And she just skewers it perfectly. I think she probably lived down the street from me when I was in Kentish Town and she was in Camden for a period of time. So for me, it's almost like I'm reading about a peer who had a much crazier lifestyle than me in her 20s, but has come out of that with an incredible amount of wisdom. And hey, you know, not every memoir has to be. I mean, I'm sure Maggie O'Farrell, I Am, is incredibly brilliant and incredibly well written. But so is Everything I Know About Love. It's just a very different story about a very different woman. I'd recommend it. I would challenge you to dislike it. But it might be possible.
Hey, I'm very open to it.
For that reason, I wonder if it would be a good book club book. I'd quite like to make men read it and see what they think.
Cool. Great. Well, it's a good, I'm feeling inspired. There's some good books there.
The other very different book I've been reading is Moneyball by Michael Lewis, our favourite man.
Are you reading that because I said it was so great? That's a
Yes.
book about baseball. Completely impenetrable subject, but boy oh boy, does he bring it to life.
I amused my husband to no end because I commented as I was reading it. So, background, I played softball, like the ladies' version of baseball, from the age of probably 8 to 14.
Is it like obligatory in Canada? Is it but like sort of doing hockey here?
I guess so. It's what you do in the spring.
Yeah.
April, May, June. You play on a team. I was rubbish. I was always in right field, the worst position. I was very happy to be benched. I was very happy to walk.
So what does there's a lot of walking in Moneyball. So walking is when you're on a base.
No.
Okay. See, there you go. Oh, Michael Lewis, if you're listening, I read your whole book and I still didn't really understand it.
I'm not going to explain walking right now, but what I will say,
but it's a good thing. I know it's a good thing.
It's not a bad thing. It gets you on base.
Yeah. For Billie Bean, it was a good thing.
For Billie Bean, the manager in Moneyball, who's kind of recreating his baseball team in light of stats and kind of insights into what actually earns you games, what wins you games. But I amused my husband. I was like, it had never occurred to me in all my time playing softball that it would ever be possible for the pitcher to decide where to throw the ball. Well, like this is how uncoordinated I am.
Yeah.
As an athlete.
Yeah,
like,
I would see that though. It's like with kids playing, it's pretty random. Yeah?
I know, but that's what. Well, yes, okay. Oh, so you're sympathetic with me?
Yes, I would.
Thank
I
you.
would also accept that. We used to do rounders in the summer, and same thing. Like, great if you and cricket also brilliant.
Yeah.
If you manage to throw it anywhere near the person with the bat,
Yeah.
you're doing well.
Well, my husband is a far better athlete than I am, and you can see him just being like, "What are you talking about?" Like, of course, professional athletes can control what they're doing.
Well, I see that obviously professional athletes can. I would. Yeah, that wouldn't be so surprising to me.
But you and I talk a lot about Michael Lewis because we love him.
Yeah,
and
he's so
everyone should read him because
Yeah.
he makes impenetrable, boring subjects fascinating.
I mean, Moneyball, I think, is really very, very, very specifically American, maybe Canadian, but he's a brilliant explainer. I always love Michael Lewis. I think of him as the man who explains things to me, but in a good way. But it does require a certain amount of underlying knowledge or a sort of basic familiarity. The brilliant thing about Michael Lewis is he's such a wonderful writer. And the stories he tells are sort of so compelling. The way he builds his characters. And this is true life. This is based on real people and real events. It's about the Oakland A's and their rise under the leadership of this guy, Billie Beane.
Which is a real name.
To the World Series.
No,
And
not the World Series.
didn't they make it to the World Series?
No,
I thought they
never
made it there, but they lost.
They made it the playoffs.
Oh, right.
That's sort of the punchline to this book. And it's not a bad thing, but if you've watched the film adaptation with Brad Pitt of Moneyball, it's quite apologetic towards the end because they never do make a World Series. That's not really the point. The point was about changing baseball.
Yeah, and so the way he changes it is that he stops looking at the received wisdom about the players who are out there and the sort of scouts who've got this sort of old time, knowledge about, well, that guy's got an amazing pitching arm, he'll go far kind of thing. He
looks great.
All of that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. What matters is what he can do. What are his stats? What do they tell us about him? And also, the Oakland A's, they didn't have much money. So he couldn't afford the fancy players that were going for sort of, 20 million. And it comes to this, what do they call it? The draft, that's right. When you get to pick your players. He couldn't afford that. So they looked at the stats. There's this sort of other guy who's the stats guy who he works with.
Paul De Podesta.
That's right. Who's played
Another
by
made-up
Jonah
name.
Hill in the movie. And they look at players who no one else wants. They specialize in players that no one else wants because the other people can't see why these players are good. And he builds this team of these players where one's got like a funny way of throwing the ball. He throws it underarm instead of overarm. And so it's completely discounted by all the other teams. But actually, Billie Beane sees that it doesn't matter if he throws it underarm. He still gets it to the guy with the
plate.
bat. Exactly, the plate. That's
And
me.
no one knows what the pitcher is going to do. Again, this is that piece of wisdom I had never clocked, that the batters can read what the pitchers are doing. So being able to surprise them is incredibly powerful.
It's just this great story about an underdog as well, isn't it? Everyone thought he was nuts. No one believed in what they were doing. And they were like, no, this is going to work. This is right. We're right. And everyone else is wrong, we were watching The Big Short the other day, which is on TV. And again, that's very much a story about a group of people who were right when everybody else was wrong. And he's sort of good at that. I love Moneyball, and I love the film of Moneyball as well. I thought it was a really good adaptation of that book. I thought they did a really good job.
I watched it as I was reading the book, and I didn't like it that much because I just think
It's not as good as the book.
It can't possibly cover everything that the book does.
Yeah.
And the book is very good at telling this story in terms of human stories as well. So you have Billie Beane and you have Paul De Podesta, but you also have all of these cast-off players who never thought they would make the big leagues, who never thought they would be stars. And Billie Beane has found them, bought them, and turned them into these incredible players. And often they're more surprised than anyone.
Yes. It's a great book. Michael Lewis is so good. Been saving his latest, which is called The Fifth Risk, which is, I think he's embedded in a government department under Trump. And it's, I think, about the sort of horrible chaos and confusion that's going on at government level and why that matters, why that's a big deal. I'm sort of, in a way, a bit anxious about reading it because I'm sure it's not going to be a very cheerful read.
Yeah, Michael Lewis would never upset you, though. I'm looking forward to that one, partially because it sounds so boring.
That's the thing, though. I think he's so great. He goes into something you never would think would be interesting. And I read, on your recommendation, actually, I read Boomerang.
Love it.
Which is his book where he travels around Europe. He goes to Iceland and then
Ireland,
Greece,
Germany,
looking at the things that led up to the 2008 financial crash, but it affected different countries in different ways. So Ireland had this huge sort of
property boom and bust, and Michael Lewis is baffled because the Irish, unlike many other countries, took the blame upon themselves when actually it wasn't the average person's fault. It
Yeah.
was property developers,
Yeah.
and they should have been left to go bankrupt.
Yeah, and they didn't let that happen, and they basically bailed them out.
And then in
they
Greece-
couldn't believe their luck. Whereas in Greece, it turns out it was all a load of monks' fault.
Well,
But it was about corruption and
no
really,
one taking the blame.
Yeah, so in a way, it was the banks were actually the kind of good guys in that situation. And Iceland, where he sort of explains how it was a nation of fishermen, but then something happened in the fishing industry that almost quite naturally led them all into being speculators in a way. And then from there, it was a very natural transition for them all to go into international banking. And so they did.
And a lot of British people invested in Icelandic banks all the
Yeah,
time because
with-
they had such high interest rates, which they couldn't afford.
Fairly catastrophic contract. But it's again, it's actually a really depressing subject. And at the end, it's very unnerving because the threat of whole countries defaulting was the issue then, and I think probably is as true now.
Did you find it depressing?
Well,
though?
yes, but you know, it's sort of simultaneously depressing and so entertaining and,
Yes.
and interesting that you know you don't mind. You're like,
Yeah,
oh,
it's
well,
only after you finish that you're a bit like, oh, maybe I should be concerned about
should I
that.
be worrying about
Should
this?
I be worried? You know, he made it just sound so interesting and kind of beyond my day-to-day life. So, you know, I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah. So yeah, the fifth risk will be coming up on a future bookshelf episode. That's all for this episode.
On our next episode, we'll be discussing The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This 1957 horror classic has recently been adapted for Netflix, but what did my book club make of the original? Were we scared out of our wits? You'll have to listen in to find out. And if you missed it, do check out our latest interview with Toby Brothers, founder of the London Literary Salon, a group that tackles the greats from Ulysses to Proust to Thomas Mann. Listen in to hear all about it.
Now, listeners, have you just read something that would make for a brilliant book club book? What's the best thing your book club has ever read? Write in and let us know, and we'll feature you on the show. Drop us a line at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, or on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.